Now if we jump over to the New Testament, because usually this is where we begin to get a little bit more aggressive, because many people would dismiss the Old Testament and say, well, that's Old Testament. We don't live in the Old Testament anymore. We live in New Testament. So let's talk about New Testament scriptures. And we may get through this pretty fast. Cool. So let's talk about Romans. Romans is probably the most complicated chapter to discuss, and especially for Christians to especially those of us who are gay, to discuss and try to bring understanding about what's going on in the book of Romans. Because again, in face value, when you read the first chapter of Romans, it leaves you with the impression that Paul is writing about homosexuality in general. And so we're going to look at some of the particular things. Now, of course, I want you to remember that in writing Romans, the book of Romans was written before Paul actually makes his trip to Rome. So he's writing based on what he knows of the area. He hasn't actually been there himself at this point. And so, and historically, go back to that time. This is around, this is 70. Yeah, this would have probably been before the destruction of the temple. This is 60, 70, 80 A.D., still during the first century after Christ. And so we know historically from that time that Rome had lots of temples, lots of idol temples, and it was a very sexual place. There was lots of promiscuity. There was lots of sexual practices in the temples. It was not anything new. Been going on thousands of years. You go back to Genesis, it was still going on. So Paul knows this going into this, and so he knows what's going on. These various gods and goddesses that Rome had, and that they were very well known for their shrine prostitutes and for their the sexual activities that were a common part of those worship practices. And so he's sending this letter ahead to the church at Rome before he gets there. And the text that most people want to use is kind of down around verse 26. Let's read that right quick. But let's back up. We're going to read the whole thing. See, I'm going to start with verse 18 of chapter 1. It says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal men and birds and animals and reptiles." Here we go. He's talking about idolatry again. So because the idolatry, he says, therefore, so we haven't changed thoughts here. He's talking about idolatry, and he says, therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. So again, he's still talking about idolatry. Because of this, continuing the thought, because of this idolatry, God gave them over to shameful lust. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty of their perversion. Furthermore, since they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. And then he goes on and continues the thought. Now, if we look in verse 26, because this is the areas that people that want to use it against homosexuals, and almost any homosexual you talk with will share in their experience that it's just a part of who they are. They've been that way. For as long as they can remember. You can go back and remember being different back long before it was a sexual thing. Just knowing that there was something different. And we all understand that. And I think one of the reasons it's hard for heterosexual people that are oriented that way to understand that is because they didn't feel different. They felt like they assumed everybody else felt. And we knew that those of us that have been in that place know what it's like to be different, because we recognize that, and we can attest to that same feeling that we have in common, and so we understand that we are I hate to say a minority, but we knew that we weren't like the majority of people around us, and we recognize that. Children are very astute and pick up on things like that very early in life, and most of us will agree with that. So if we look at in verse 26, in the Greek word, and the Romans was written in Greek. The first use of the word natural occurs. It says, because God gave them a shame life, even the women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. And this is where it gets complicated. Because the word in the Greek is phusis, Phusis, phusis. Vines interprets phusis as to be the natural powers or the constitution of a person or thing. Strong refers to it as a native disposition. And the second two times that the word natural is used, the term phusikos, Phusikos, is used, which literally means physical or instinctive. And it's the same root from which the other phusis comes to. So Paul writes here that these women gave themselves, abandoned their natural disposition for an unnatural one. And the word he uses are terms that refer to instinctive things. They refer to things that are a part of the being, not necessarily the flesh. The term that's used for flesh when we talk about sin nature and we talk about fleshly desires, the word in the Greek there is sarx, S-A-R-X, sarx. And that refers to what we use in Christian terms you call the flesh, or the sin nature. It's the weaknesses and the passions, the desires that we have control, that we should have control over. But the term phusis refers to an instinctive part, something that is a part of who you are. You have no control over. It refers to a thing that is something that is built into who you are, that you can't change. It's biological more than it is behavioral. And so Paul says here that there were these people who abandoned their native dispositions. They abandoned what was natural to them to do what was unnatural. And even today, I would agree very strongly that it would be just as wrong for a heterosexual man to abandon his instinctive orientation to act as a gay man. And on the same coin, I would say it would be extremely inappropriate. It would be wrong for a gay man who is instinctively and natively disposition is that nature and that orientation to act as a heterosexual man, because it is contrary to his natural, his instinctive being. And so Paul says that where we get into is that and why the heterosexual community often has a problem is because they want to assume that what is natural to them should be natural to everyone, and it's not. It's not in nature. When we talked about that earlier, and homosexuality occurs in nature. It is just because what is natural to us doesn't mean it's natural to everyone else. And that is what Paul is getting across here. He's saying they did not because it was their nature to do so, but because they went against their own nature to serve these idols. They were willing to do these acts that went against their instinctive desires, their instinctive being, as a part of their idol worship. Because of the idolatry, they abandoned who they were to serve the idol. And yes, I do agree with Paul that would be wrong. It would be extremely wrong for people to abandon who they are to serve an idol. I think it would be as wrong for those of us who are gay to do it as it is for those of us, those people that are heterosexual to do it.